Hello, I'm Lisa Fairbanks. In this program, we discuss learning disabilities, collective perspectives. What is a learning disability? There are some common myths about their definition. There are also facts.
Could you define the term learning disability?
Such as somebody with dyslexia, I think, or somebody who has a hard time comprehending. I mean, they sit in class, listen, or don't listen. Not listening is a learning disability. A lot of people have it.
Right, you aren't really comprehending what you're learning.
Or just memorizing things might be a little difficult.
And there's a broad range of different kinds.
Someone who has a problem learning the way things are taught in traditional schools.
Disability, well, it'd have to be something that you're probably born with, or something that you acquire that inhibits your learning, like dyslexia or something, where you have problems reading, or maybe you have some hearing problems, but it wouldn't be it's different from retardation though.
Learning disabilities can be simple or complex, but they usually include a few distinct characteristics. An average or above average intelligence, and sometimes a superior intelligence.
An area where students have some type of problem with a perception or learning. They're not necessarily linked to being very intelligent or the opposite of that, but essentially they're dealing with a difficulty. And when we deal with learning disabilities, we're dealing with maybe unlocking a door, finding the right key.
A learning disability to me basically means that that person just learns in a different manner, really. It doesn't mean that they have any less intelligence or any more intelligence. It just means that they have a different learning style.
If she has a learning disability, she has about a 3.4 grade average, and yet she can't spell at all, and her words she thinks they're right, and she can't figure out what's wrong with the words and they're spelled wrong.
A student who is not achieving up to his potential in at least one academic area could have a learning disability.
I had a difficult time with English classes, difficult time expressing myself, especially in writing, and I had a difficult time in mathematics, especially the early years, about 2nd to 4th grade, maybe up into 5th and 6th grade. I had a difficult time with math.
For those cases, I requested testing because I saw the child struggling. And learning disabilities show up in different children in different ways. Our oldest son had trouble with written language and impossible for him to spell. You would go over and over his spelling lessons with him. You'd think he had them down. 5 minutes later, you'd quiz him again. He didn't know how to spell the words. Very difficult for him with reading and writing skills. In our daughter, it showed up in 2nd grade, and by 2nd grade, she was already turned off to school, hated it.
Our daughter had a problem with reading, basically, and it was breaking down the words, and she still has somewhat a problem with spelling. It's kind of fun to read her spelling, but it's nothing serious. She's at the University of Montana right now, in fact, as an English major, so she's overcome that.
Frustration when they don't understand something, or they can't learn as easily as other children. As far as their other abilities are very normal.
Students with a learning disability often will have neurological processing impairments in their sight, hearing, or perception. Those impairments interfere with attention, concentration, listening comprehension, oral expression, and the storage, recall, and use of symbolic language.
test scores on things that we do in class, having lower test scores than other kids, and taking a longer time to do an activity that we do in class.
I think that oftentimes people don't realize that these problems even exist because kids act out or misbehave, and they're covering up for what they aren't doing correctly. And it's much easier for them to be disciplined than to be discovered.
I think one thing that would be really important is just education of teachers. Because if a teacher doesn't know how to identify a learning disability, whatever that might be, then that child could go through several grades before that's identified. And an example would be my dad, who has dyslexia, but nobody knew about it when he went through grade school or high school. And he even repeated, I think it was 4th or 5th grade, and a lot of teachers just thought that he wasn't working very hard or that he wasn't very smart.
Learning disabilities are not uncommon. Individuals with learning disabilities are found in all races, socioeconomic groups, and cultural environments. Students with learning disabilities are found throughout the nation, regardless of different school environments. More and more information is being gathered about the subject of learning disabilities. 4 to 5% of the students in the United States have a learning disability. There are about 25 million Americans who have some kind of learning disability. According to Psychology Today magazine, there are many famous individuals who were thought to have had a learning disability. Albert Einstein, Thomas Edison, George Patton, Leonardo da Vinci, Hans Christian Andersen, and Nelson Rockefeller. Current public figures who describe themselves as being learning disabled are Olympic decathlon winner Bruce Jenner, actor Tom Cruise, and Olympic diving champion Greg Louganis. According to the Association for Children with Learning Disabilities, 4% of the students entering college each year have an identified learning disability. Some experts believe that there are at least 25,000 students already identified as learning disabled in college. Other experts suspect that the figures are even higher. Over 2,300 colleges and universities have programs for students with learning disabilities. About 200 students in Missoula County High Schools have been identified as having a learning disability. What is it like, then, for a person to live with a learning disability? Students with a learning disability often have a low tolerance for frustration, a lack of self-confidence in certain academic areas, a dislike for traditional school, a lack of motivation, and a keen talent of avoidance.
These issues are expressed in the following paper written by a student with a learning disability. I feel, even though I know I need to have a school education, that I just don't have the motivation to do school. I find myself just thinking that it just isn't worth the power. It's so hard to do some things, like if I get an assignment that I have to read something or look something up to do it, I just don't want to do it, to the point that it bugs me inside to do it. It's so hard and confusing that I may get a headache or just become tired thinking about doing it. Since I have this bad feeling, I find ways to get out of doing it, or I make up excuses that it doesn't matter. But then if I really understand something, like a math problem I understand, or a science method I understand, I have no problem doing these assignments. It actually makes me feel good. Often I'll be motivated at school to do some assignment, and then when I get home it's just not in me to do it, so I'll put it off until I forget about it, and then I find myself in trouble with grades the next day, and I feel down. But it just happens again. Often I find myself getting behind in classes and not keeping up with the class.
Here are two people who had their learning disabilities diagnosed when they were in high school.
Hi, I'm Jill Froelich, and I'm a student at the University of Montana, and I will also be playing for the Lady Grizz in the fall.
Jill, we appreciate...
A learning disability for me would be something that impairs me a little bit, not to be able to do some of the things that I want to do without an extra bit of help. Something that just, it's not bad, it's just something that makes school and learning a little bit harder, but it's not something that, you know, anyone should be ashamed of, I don't think. I had dyslexia where I would reverse things, and I also had a really hard time taking tests. But it's something I'm working with. I had a really hard time in school, and then when I got into high school, I was having an even harder time, and I had a lot of goals for myself that I wanted to obtain in the future, and I was being set back all the time because in school it was really hard. And at first, people just, all my teachers, my parents thought I was lazy for a while, and it was like I wasn't working in school. But the more and more that we, talked about it, and they saw how I was not progressing in school, they realized that there was something wrong. So I found out what learning disabilities I did have and how to go about working with them to overcome them. And so now I'm just working with tutors, and I work with my parents a lot as far as in school. In school now what I do is I tape record all my classes, which really helps a lot because I have a hard time concentrating, so I have it on tape and I can go back and listen. I always make it a point to sit in the very front of the class because then you're more likely to pay attention longer. I have my tests not timed, and I take them by myself, which really helps a lot because I don't feel any pressure and I can just concentrate on what I'm doing. I make sure that I have a pretty familiar relationship with my professors. That helps a lot if they know where I'm coming from, and then they can help me a little bit more. I work with a tutor, Linda Maas, who's been just great for me, and she helps me in all the areas. Not so much she doesn't do the work for me, but she helps me get started and how to go about doing certain things and proofreading and stuff like that. I have a hard time with writing papers, but she goes through and proofreads them and checks for spelling and everything, which helps a lot. Just little things, like the littlest things, like just sitting up in the front row. I couldn't believe how much easier school got for me, just by doing the little things like that. You go through school and you're having a hard time and you're frustrated, most people will just give up. And so I think that, if teachers spot a problem, they should work with it, especially in the younger age, because that's when you want to catch it and make, their future a lot easier. A learning disability is nothing to be embarrassed about. There's nothing wrong with it. I think that a lot of people think there is something wrong with having a learning disability, but that's not it. There's a lot of people who have them that you don't even know that they have them.
My name's Brett Weatherman, and I'm a junior here at the University of Montana. And my major is elementary education, and I have picking up a minor in Native American Studies. And I'm here to talk about my learning disability, which is dyslexia. A learning disability to me basically means that that person just learns in a different manner, really. It doesn't mean that they have any less intelligence or any more intelligence. It just means that they have a different learning style. I had a difficult time with English classes, difficult time expressing myself, especially in writing, and I had a difficult time in mathematics, especially the early years, about 2nd to 4th grade, maybe up into 5th and 6th grade. I had a difficult time with math. I was in 4th grade that I had realized that something wasn't quite right in school. I wasn't doing well all the way through grade school, and by the time I was in 4th grade, I was tested to see if I had some kind of learning disability, and I was held back for a 2nd year in 4th grade, and that's when I understood that I had a learning disability. I didn't really understand what it meant to have dyslexia. I didn't know how to fix it or anything like that. I just knew that something wasn't quite right. So by about 4th grade, one of the first things I learned to do was to be an observer. Since I didn't do very well in class and I had a difficult time expressing myself, or I didn't do very well grade-wise, I ended up just kind of being quiet and just kind of hanging out in the back of the classroom and not saying a whole lot. And I just observed the class. And just through that observation, instead of learning the studies that I was supposed to, either math or science or history or whatever, what I ended up learning was human behavior, because what was really going to help me was learning to work with other people. And a really good example of this is when I was in high school. And what I would do is, the first couple days of class, I would always read the entire classroom. And I would look around and I would see who the smart people in class were that did really well, and also the people that were really helpful. And if I could, I would sit next to one of these people and have them help me. And an example might be, say just through observing this person, I knew that whenever they had a hard time spelling a word, they would write it out on the desk. And maybe I had a difficult time spelling, say I didn't know how to spell the word glass, a real easy word, but I wasn't sure if I had one S or two, and I was kind of embarrassed to ask somebody. So what I'd actually end up doing, again, I chose to sit next to this person that did really well in school and would always help me. I would phrase a question so it was a little more difficult. And I might look over to him and I might say, is the word looking glass one word or two? And they might go, well, I think it's one. And then I'd maybe doubt their intelligence a little bit and go, are you sure? I think maybe it's two words. And then, of course, remembering that they wrote words out on the desk, they might lean over and write looking glass, and I'd look over, G-L-A-S-S. I got all I needed. And then I'd thank them, yeah, I think you're right. So I got through grade school and high school a lot of times just through observing. A patient family, I have a really, really close-knit family. That was a big help. And my teachers, I had a lot of really good teachers that didn't give up on me as a student, didn't let me give up myself. They always challenged me. The teachers made a huge difference. And one thing that I think would have made a big difference, would have helped me a lot, would have been computers. The personal computers. I use one at home now with the word perfect because I have a really difficult time spelling. And one nice thing about computers is they're infinitely patient. You can sit there and you can play on a computer all day long, and if you don't have the right answer, the computer will just sit there and wait for you to give the correct answer. I think computers would have made a big difference. If you have a learning disability, that's what you just have to get used to, or that it might take you a little longer to learn something. I know that I had to take an algebra class twice in high school, and then I flunked it the first time, I got a D the second time, and then in college I took it and finally ended up passing it and getting a good grade. So it took me 3 times to complete one class. So you have to be patient. You can't give up on yourself. And I maybe even look at the disability instead of a disability as maybe even a gift, because in a lot of ways I've benefited a lot from my dyslexia, and one way that I've benefited is by learning how to work really hard, learning how to work with others, because in order to get through school I had to work with other people. But mainly being patient, just not giving up on yourself. And I remember when I was younger, I might work 7-8 hours on a paper and work really hard, and just because I had a difficult time with it, get a D on it. Yet have a friend who only worked maybe 2 hours and got an A on the paper. Yet I did a lot more work. And I remember noticing that, and that really hurt to get a grade back that to everyone else looked like I didn't do very well, in that subject.
One 14-year-old boy said his head was like a television set, only without a channel selector. All the programs come over the screen at the same time. Parents have a different but equally challenging story about discovering their children's learning disabilities. We're here with Ray Jean Johnson. She has a son and a daughter. The son has just graduated from high school, and the daughter is 17, is still in Sentinel High School. And she's here to talk about her experiences with them and with learning disabilities. So I guess first, I'll just have you define what you think a learning disability is.
My experience with my children is frustration when they don't understand something, or they can't learn as easily as other children. As far as their other abilities are very normal. And they do get real frustrated when they're not able to do the work that's given to them by their teachers in certain areas.
It might be that parents, when they have one child that has a disability, are looking for it, and they're more willing to look for it and to combat it. Do you think that that's true, that you were more, because you had one child and you experienced what you went through to help that child, did you look for it more in your next child?
I don't know that I look for it more. I have somewhat of a learning disability myself, although when I went to school there was no help for it. So when I found out what there was available, which until I started looking into it and asking for help, did I know that, how much there was for the kids. And we've gotten a great deal of help, but after a lot of persuasion on my part to especially take my son. My daughter's disability isn't as bad as his, so, but we've done a lot of fighting and we've gotten him through, and he graduated from high school this year, so he did well.
If your son didn't kind of define his learning disability till he was in 5th grade, what kind of ramifications did that have on them, socially and, you know, mentally?
Well, they definitely want to be as normal, which they are normal. And this is the most important thing for them, is not to let the other kids know that there's something wrong, that they're set aside from someone else, because they're not. They're just as normal as the rest of us. They just have a learning disability. They need to be build up their confidence that, okay, and reassure them that there is, you know, this is just a one problem that needs to be solved. The rest of them is, they're perfectly normal in every other way. And I think too often they're set aside and made examples of. I don't think that needs to be. They need to be helped in that particular area and treat them as normal as they can.
Hello, I'm Lisa Fairbanks, and I'm here with Diane Weatherman, and she's a mother of 3 kids who went through Sentinel. How would you define a learning disability? Just a broad general definition, I guess.
I guess it would just be anything that keeps a child from the normal learning process. I'm not real an authority on exactly how they are described. I know how they show up in children. I know how they showed up in my children.
Okay, and do you want to talk about that a little bit?
The first child, we had no previous experience with a child, so we didn't know what was normal and what was abnormal. But by the time he got to 3rd grade, a teacher pointed out to us that he was having some difficulty, and she showed us some papers that he had written, and his letters were reversed in a number of places and a few numbers, and this was indicative to her of a problem. She sent us to an eye doctor, which was not the problem, but fortunately we went to an eye doctor who is dyslexic. And he never did conduct an eye exam. He looked at the paper and said, I know what's wrong with your child. I have dyslexia also, and sent us at that time to a center where they did some testing. It was at that time at Community Hospital. And at that time our oldest child was tested and found to be learning disabled, and also found to be an entire year behind in school. The other children, then we were looking for a problem, and it did show up at various other times, and we found it earlier with the other children. By the 3rd time, I was told when our youngest child was in kindergarten that he was tested and was learning disabled, and at that time I just sat down and cried. I couldn't believe it had happened for the 3rd time. So all 3 were tested. Fortunately, as we learned to look for the problem, we found it earlier and earlier, which made it easier for the children. Each of the children has what I call a special teacher, somebody who really made a difference for them, who took a hold of them and said, this is what you've got to deal with it, and you'll just have to learn to deal with it, and gave them special help. And with each child, I can see that there was that special person, and I'm grateful for that. The school system also has special classes where the child can be taken out of the mainstream and taken into resource rooms. And we had varying results with resource rooms and resource room teachers. Some worked very well with the children, some it didn't work as well. You have to understand that the older the child gets, the more they resent being different, and the more they resent being taken out of the classroom and made to go somewhere else and learn differently. And so you're handling a whole range of problems having to do with peer pressure and their own emotional response, as well as what the special needs they have in school.
Okay. And with all of those difficulties that you have in mind, how do you think would be the most successful way to bring all those together and have a program that they would still be in the mainstream of the education? How do you think that could work? What would be a good?
I don't know that I have the answers. It's really difficult. I think some children can be mainstreamed with special help. I think some need different schooling. I think some just need a non-traditional type of schooling. And I feel that we have two that mainstreamed fairly well and one who probably should have been in a separate type of schooling altogether. And I think it's so individual. And the resources are available or becoming available in Missoula. The teachers and the staffs were very good at pointing them out to us. And there are resources available. But I don't know that there are resources for every child.
As a parent, are there any other either personal or general concerns or opinions that you have about how students are handled who have learning disabilities or how it could be improved?
Well, I have a lot of respect for what goes on in Missoula, and we had fantastic help both in the elementary schools and especially at Sentinel. We had great help at Sentinel. What it boils down to really, though, is that the child has to work through this problem, and so the parents are going to really handle a lot at home, and each of our children had their own way of coping. They each developed their own coping skills, and it seemed to show up in the kind of personality they had. The oldest one was quiet, and so he was withdrawn and shy. The next one is more aggressive, more social, and she developed a chip on her shoulder. She was angry that she was different and that she couldn't achieve even though she knew she was very bright. And the youngest one is a class clown. They all have their way of coping, and I think they need those coping skills. What concerns me is the loss of self-esteem. You can imagine that if you got up every morning and went to work and you could never achieve, someone was always saying, no, it isn't right, you didn't do it correctly, it's just going to be devastating. And that's what these children have every day. And that is, I think, the hardest part for the parent.
We're here with Roger and Sue Bergmeyer, parents of two kids who one is still in high school or just graduated, and the other is a junior at the University of Montana. And they're here to talk to us a little bit about learning disabilities, maybe how they've dealt with them or what they know about them, their experiences. So I guess I'll start out, if either one of you kind of want to tell me what you think a learning disability is.
Well, a learning disability is simply a person's ability to learn is hampered by the way they process information so that they have to learn differently. There's lots of potential there. It is just that the learning style is very different. So we have to do different things for them to learn the same amount of information that an average person can learn.
And if there's one thing we would like to see in the future on these things is that the kids that have these problems, or there's some indication that there are these problems, that it be addressed as early as possible, because kids learn much better as younger kids, and it gets harder as they become young adults and then as adults. So getting to the problem, identifying it first, and doing it early, I think is really important.
How you think a program could be set up that could help students more directly with learning disabilities?
Probably the most important thing, I think, is not to always look at the disabilities the same way. I mean, it's the old paradigm theory, you've always done it this way and it works, and we know that this kid has these needs, so we do it this way. A lot of times, just totally looking at the problem from a totally different perspective changes the results dramatically. And I think that everybody does that in what they do in their profession. This is the way you're trained, this is what you do, this is the answers, and those answers always change. And I think that it's really difficult, as hard of a job as it is teaching, to be able to step outside that role and look at it from a different perspective. And I think maybe that's a thing that parents can really do and help the school system, is because they come at it from a different perspective. They see the child in a different atmosphere than the teachers do. And a lot of times some things that a child does outside the school can be adapted to the school situation. But it takes two-way communication because the child needs to communicate too. Three-way communication to...
How do you think there would be ways for teachers, primarily the school system, and also parents, to improve the process of learning, make it maybe more of have different kinds of ways to teach, more visual ways or more teaching with more application. How do you think that process could be changed? Even, I mean, there's radical change, but even just real general.
Well, as Sue mentioned, people learn differently. Some people read things and they learn well that way. Other people have to hear things and write them down to get a grasp of it, to understand it. Other people have to feel things, physically feel things in order to learn it properly. So there are different ways that the teachers are going to have to teach these kids because they have learning differences, maybe not a disability, but differences. Video might be one way of doing it, or tape might be another, or reading, changing, printing, for instance, might be something that's important, larger print. Another problem I didn't mention earlier was our son has a slight dyslexia problem. So he has difficulty reading fine print, small print. So there's all these different things, and John's just one of the types of problems that we have out there. And there's other kids, that may have all those problems, plus may be slightly handicapped physically too at the same time. So it's a thing where you have to tailor the education to the kid. I think what's happened in some of the school systems is systems are developed for a group of kids, and the kid is you try to put the kid into that slot, and he does as good as he can in that particular slot. But maybe that doesn't work very well. It has to be tailored for the individual.
What do teachers have to say about students with learning disabilities? I'm with Sue Dolezal, who is a math teacher at Sentinel High School. Kind of define what you think a learning disability is, maybe specifically to math, but also generally.
I think I have a real broad-based definition of a learning disability in a classroom. And that's whenever the student's learning needs don't meet the teacher's teaching style. For instance, if you have a teacher who sees things and talks with their hands, and you have a sight-impaired student, their learning styles aren't compatible at all, and so the student is obviously going to be learning impaired. But there are other teachers who only explain things one way. They see things very, very sequentially, and this happens frequently in a math classroom. And they have one explanation mode. That's the way they think through the problem. And they might be losing half the kids in the class who are visual learners or who are experiential learners. And so whenever a student's learning needs aren't the same as a teacher's teaching style, I think you have a learning impairment. Beyond that, I think that there are other things that we don't even know to classify as learning impairments right now. Sometimes people can listen to something and hear it, but they can't process it. Or they can see it, but it does not sink in the way it does for other people. So there are so many subtle things that I don't think we consider. Of course, there's larger, what are learning disabilities that are obvious and they're already classified, and we pick up on those. I think that for a lot of reasons we need to be more sensitive to covering as many styles as we possibly can.
So then how do you go about the process of teaching math? Is that something that you do, is try and make it both visual and experiential? How do you do that?
I probably don't do enough of the experiential just because it requires a lot more time. And at the high school level, sometimes we're really constrained as to how much time we have to spend on anything. As far as instructions go, yes, I try to say them. In a high school classroom, sometimes you say them many times and very loudly, and I also write them on the board every time. And I try when I'm writing, I'm a chalkboard person, and I do the problem on the center chalkboard. I draw a picture of it on a side chalkboard, and I do my scratch work over on another side chalkboard so that they see there is a development to it. You don't just sit down and go, I've got the answer, and write it down. Everybody has to think through the process. The more examples you can give, the more illustrations you can give, the more you can link it to what they're doing in their own life, to science class or to some hobby they have, the better they'll learn it. There is so very, very much we have to learn about the learning process. Everybody needs more opportunities. But then again, maybe the teachers can be trained better to give more kinds of learning experiences in the classroom.
We're here now with Bruce Beatty, Earth Science and Geology teacher at Hellgate High School. You define learning disabilities. It's kind of a broad term, but as you see them applying to students.
I see students with learning disabilities as just having difficulty in school. Something impairs their process so they don't learn at the same rate as other kids.
What kind of problems do students have?
Well, in science, you need to group things, you need to sort things, you need to make observations on certain characteristics of things. There is some memorization, but a lot of what we try to do in our school in science is deal with the processes of science rather than memorization of a large number of terms.
I'm with John Famel, principal of Hellgate High School. Have you known children or even adults who have not maybe identified their learning disability as a child? Have you known those individuals who have learning disabilities?
I've known them. I've known people my age, that's getting pretty old, and that have had learning disabilities. They now realize it because 20 years ago in public education, not as much was said or as known, or at least to somebody like me, who I'm not a special ed person, for example, trained in that area. And as an administrator, there were some things we didn't pay attention to about 20 or 15 years ago that now we're learning much more about, and we have much more to learn. And so we're finding some people in my age bracket, or even 10 years younger, in their 30s, saying, I now understand or recognize some problems I had. I wish they'd known that then. My life could have been so different. First of all, we need to identify as many learning difficulties as we can. We need to also study, and by we I mean faculty, administration, anyone involved in education, aides, etc. We need to look at different learning styles as well. So we need to be able to identify and then address how do we help a certain student or students with specific learning disabilities. That's crucial.
We kind of touched upon this before. How would you set up a program to deal with students who have varying degrees of learning disabilities? After you've kind of determined that they do have a learning disability, how do you get them to try and understand it and cope with it, and how would you set up a program to deal with it?
I think basically I would do what we're doing now, and that is whenever it's been suspected, we go from the suspicion or somehow we go from not knowing of a problem to knowing about a problem. And essentially, somewhere along the line, either through testing and we pick up a problem, or through reported behavior, different from the norm in some way, somehow it comes to the attention of a counselor or another professional person on the staff. So what we wind up doing is we start looking at that situation. We start looking at some of the work, some of the performance, maybe even some of the history at home, the out-of-school performance of a student. And eventually, we're going to get into a staffing situation whereby we're going to be meeting with a group of people that are really interested in that student. And I'm talking about whether it's high school age or earlier than high school, in the elementary school age. Ideally, I'd like to see as much of this caught as possible early on so you could work with the problem sooner. I would rather work with acorns than trees, in other words. So I guess what I'm saying is you identify that you have a problem, you get the parents involved, hopefully cooperatively, and you try to determine just what is wrong. And you look at the full spectrum of student performance in and out of school. You try to identify through various tests and through interviews and through researching what the student has been doing in class by those teachers, what might be wrong. And usually they fall into some main categories, not always, but usually. And then we perform what we call an individualized educational prescription, known in the education community as IEP. And there we actually tailor a program that will best serve that student. If the student has a problem with short-term memory, we will start looking at ways to reinforce that student exposure to content area. If the student needs more time to work with special teachers in addition to the regular teachers, because remember our emphasis is least restrictive environment. Try not to remove a student from a mainstream setting. Try to serve them in that setting, give them all the support and consideration they need.
If a student is suspected of having a learning disability, he or she is tested in a number of areas. The parent, student, and education professionals meet in a child study team meeting to determine if the student does have a learning disability. If so, that student is qualified to obtain special help from the school.
Hey, this is a child study team meeting to determine whether or not Mark Loston Jr., birth date of 9/20/75, qualifies under special education guidelines as a student with a disability that interferes with his educational preference. And who is going to give the reason for the referral?
I have those reasons. Mark was referred by his counselor at the request of Mrs. Rod, his English instructor.
At this point, we're going to go through different areas of review of Mark's background. I'd like to this time start with Cindy and our home school coordinator to give home background, please.
Mark, I met with your dad a couple of weeks ago, and what we do is we take a look at how things are going outside of school for you and also look into your developmental and health history. So if you'd like to make any comments as I go along, feel free since you weren't there, okay?
Okay, and Lorene, anything on speech, hearing, or language?
Yes, I did do hearing, speech, and language screening with Mark. Mark has good hearing. He passed the hearing screening.
If you have any questions about the results, please ask me. You too, Mark. The definition of a learning disability is that a student has average or above average intelligence, but they are not achieving up to their potential in reading, spelling, mathematics, or written language, or a combination of those areas. And they also have difficulty processing information, how they perceive it, analyze it, and recall it. So we administer these tests to find out what the student's strengths and weaknesses are, and to determine if there is indeed a learning disability. The first test that Mark took is called the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for
Learning disabilities often go undiagnosed. Because they have learned to compensate for their disability, most often those students are very creative in other areas. They identify their own areas of difficulty, are willing to accept assistance, are not stereotypical in terms of success, and can and will become productive, successful citizens. If you have any questions about learning disabilities, contact your local principal or school counselor. We hope you understand more about learning disabilities from this program. For the Missoula County High Schools, I'm Lisa Fairbanks.